The bounty of our American food supply is such an abundant blessing that most of us take it for granted. Yet our own vulnerability is a very real issue, and it exceeds well beyond our farms, our factories, and our borders. A fact made abundantly clear numerous times in our history, most recently by the pandemic. Issues such as famine or disruptions in our food chain due to severe climate change impact, war and conflict, or economic hardship is often minimalized. These are the problems that other countries experience, worlds apart from the vast American abundance that we complacently take advantage of. And instead we have embraced, once more, a carefree disassociation with food. Just look at the common practice these days of so many American homes ordering groceries online and having them brought right to the door. Convenient, sure. Dangerous, I fear. I'm Jeff Oppenheim, and I invite you to join me for this episode of Harmony in Chaos as we look at the future of food. I'm Jeff Oppenheim, documentary filmmaker, digital journalist, and host of this series. Today I am going to be talking with experts safeguarding our food distribution system in their daily practice, and thereby bringing us or reconnecting us to an ethical and even ecumenical food chain. Now, as a self-proclaimed New York City boy, I have to tell you, I can't think of a better place to do today's program in particular than the Rio Grande Valley. If you've never been down there, even if you think you know Texas, I encourage you to go down there and explore. It is incredible, from the flora, the fauna, the community is wonderful and inviting, and interestingly enough, it really gives you a sense of some of the hotbed issues in the news today, not just regionally and directed as such, but even the discussion points, much like our conversation today on the future of food. Now, it's one of the reasons that, in fact, we created this series, Harmony in Chaos, in partnership with the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. Particularly, we are working with their International Studies Department under the good governance of Jaime Ortiz, Professor Ortiz, and of course, under the School of Social Work. We're also producing this with Dr. Luis Torres. So thank you, gentlemen. Once again, I am paired with and proud to be working with my co-producer, Lieve Hammaker, to bring you this series, and truly an incredible panel she has helped me put together today. I don't want to delay much further other than one other bit of homework, which of course is the standard caveat. What is it? Well, the opinions expressed here are not necessarily that of the university. They are either my own and or that of the experience and expertise of each of the panels. So with that little bit of work out of the way, and without further ado, I want to introduce you to today's panel. Specifically, I want to start with two of our panelists who hail from Texas and are working deeply in Texas, one in particular in the Rio Grande Valley. Dr. Jeremy Everett of the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty is joining us today. Among his many credits, he's also the author of this book, I Was Hungry. Also, Professor Alexis Rosales is the Houston Endowed Chair for Science and Technology and Distinguished Teaching Professor. Where? Well, at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Let me ask you to set the stage, if you would, for today's conversation. If you could offer us a historical context of Texas as an agro-state, and then specifically of the region, the RGV, as its impact on the agro-economy, both domestically at large, nationally, as well as locally, and inclusive of course, its ports. Dr. Everett?
Jeff, well, thank you for the invitation to be with all of you today, and to my fellow panelists. This is such an incredible group of people doing incredible work in Texas and around the world, literally. And so we're glad to be with you all to talk about the future of food. So I, Jeremy Everett, serve as the executive director of the Baylor University Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty. Our primary focus is on access. So if you think about production, which Dr. Rosales is going to speak a little bit about. Right now, our farmers and ranchers produce enough food to ensure that no one would go hungry, whether that be in Texas, around the U.S., or even around the world. Yet in Texas, we have 5.5 million people that are food insecure. We are now the most food insecure state in the United States, even with production levels being what they are. For much of the work, it's thinking about how do we build a food system that's not simply built as an economic commodity. Now, if any one of us have the resources, we can buy whatever food we want, probably whenever we want it, wherever we want it. But if you are in a low income household, if you're in a low income neighborhood or a community without economic resources, we have not built a food system to work for you. And so that's why we see food insecurity and diet related disease as two sides to the same coin. And so if we can strengthen both the production and the location of production, and also build a system that's thinking about families that are living in impoverished households to ensure that they have greater accessibility to the resources, that to me is where we're truly building a food system that works for everybody. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Dr. Rosales.
Thank you, Dr. Everett. Yeah, I think what you hit the nail on the head when you talk about access. And the state of Texas, and in particular the Rio Grande Valley, is a prime example of that. For those who aren't aware, that the Rio Grande Valley sits at the southernmost part of the state of Texas. It has a very unique climate, which lends to food production almost year round. We have some rich alluvial soils, and up until recently, we've had a lot of access to water. Now, however, what that means is that the Rio Grande Valley has become a breadbasket for the state. We lead the state in the production of fruits and in vegetables. Where all of the state's citrus comes from the Rio Grande Valley. We're also one of the national leaders in the production of grains, in particular of sorghum. And yet, when you look at the food access in the Rio Grande Valley, where we have the highest percentage of our residents who are classified as obese or near obese, we have a high rates of food-related diseases, and as Dr. Everett mentioned, we have extreme rates of hunger. And when you think about how much food is not only produced here in the Rio Grande Valley, but brought through the Rio Grande Valley, where the Rio Grande Valley has 4 of the largest land ports in the country, where we bring in a lot of food from South and Central America through our port of entries here along the U.S.-Mexico border. The question is why is our own population so hungry?
Well, I was doing a little preparation for today's seminar, and it was interesting to read that Texas represents nearly 30 billion, that's billion, in the U.S. agroeconomy. And that's according to the USDA from a report done April 2024. And of course, you can't talk about the area without really talking about and seeing its many ports. One of the bigger ones, of course, is the port of Brownsville. And it was interesting to note that that port alone generates 12 billion, once again, billion, in total U.S. economic activity. And that's from a report as 2023. It locally contributes 1.1 billion to the RGV community at large. So this is a substantial area. It's curious then to note, if it's producing and bringing in this much food, what's the holdup? What's the blockade? Why is it not then reaching the people?
Well, in my perspective, what unfortunately has happened is there's a number of different issues, right? I think the commodification of food is one of them, where food is not, is now considered a global commodity. We grow citrus here in Texas, and we ship that citrus to other parts of the world. Meanwhile, our school districts, which serve citrus to our schools, to our students every single day of the year, they import all of the citrus from California and Florida. So when you think about Mission, Texas, for example, which is the citrus capital of Texas, with all of its students, every day they are served citrus, and all of that citrus interest comes from 1600. For why, I'm not sure.
Well, Texas, of course, is also a state that knows very well the impact of severe weather conditions and the increase therein of those conditions. And I can say firsthand, the last time I traveled there, I witnessed it because I flew into McAllen in the middle of one of the big hurricane storms. And a week later, I almost didn't get to fly out of Harlingen because the flooding was still so severe. The airport had been closed right up until about the second half of the day before I was supposed to leave. So I know I also overlapped, in fact, with our next guest without realizing it, because John Torpy was down there as well in his role as Director of Response for World Central Kitchen. John, can you tell me what your experience was, what sent you down to the RGV, and bring us up to date on that?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. We've been down there a few times, and we've been all over Texas for the most part. The flooding in the McAllen, Brownsville, Reynosa area was pretty devastating. I mean, there was a lot of water. It was certainly unexpected. It happened very quickly. I think it caught a lot of people by surprise. So there were a lot of people that were evacuated that had to move around. Not only that, and it wasn't just in Texas, but it was also in Mexico, in Reynosa. So, we had two different areas that we were looking at very quickly. The great thing is we had been down there prior. We've been in Amarillo, we've been in South Texas numerous times. So we have some pretty good restaurant partners there. And obviously with World Central Kitchen is we want to move in quickly. We want to make sure that people feel that somebody's looking after them. People feel a hope. So we immediately contacted some of our really neat restaurants down there that we've worked with before, and just told them to start cooking food, start cooking meals, start cooking things that people would enjoy, and we'll figure the rest out. Right? Where are people sheltering? Where are people going? But most importantly, it's getting that door to door to the people that need it. It's really kind of searching them out, letting them know we're there, letting them know they have a meal. So yeah, we've had a lot of experience down there. It's great to use the local community. Almost everything we did was locals, from the restaurants to the distribution to Catholic Charities, who was giving us ideas on where to go, how to help. The communities, the mayors down, especially the mayor down in Harlingen where we were working, and we found a couple people in Reynosa where they could start making meals immediately. And the great thing about it is when you're doing this locally, you're not only supporting the community, but you're putting food out there that's culturally appropriate, that people like, that people enjoy. We're not bringing in something else. It's comfort food in a really devastated time.
Well, John, in many ways, that represents the very founding of World Central Kitchen, of course. Can you talk about the early days of when Chef Jose formed WCK?
Yeah, World Central Kitchen was founded in 2010. Jose Andres, a very famous chef in the world from Spain, now lives in the United States, was down. There was devastation all over the Caribbean, Haiti, Puerto Rico, and he really wanted to figure out how he could help, how he could lend a hand. He was a very successful man and wanted to give back, and just started cooking. It's as easy as that, right? This is what I do. This is how I can help. I'm going to start cooking for people in the community. And more and more people wanted to help out. More and more people wanted to jump in. And it's just become a fabulous organization that's worked all over the world. I myself have been in Europe, in Africa, South America. I haven't been. We've worked in Asia, most recently in the earthquakes in Myanmar. Currently, I have people on the ground in Canada with all the fires going on, all the people being evacuated to Winnipeg. So it's really it's a small but mighty organization, and we're all over the world right now. Gaza, Ukraine, as I said, Canada, just leaving Myanmar, and there's a storm heading to Mexico as we speak. So we're keeping an eye on that as it stands right now, ready to help.
One of the other issues that we have to address when we talk about food supply is, of course, immigration, migration, which is the better aspect of our labor force in order to get the food to our tables, to our supermarkets and to our tables. And the RGV in particular, being the southernmost border with Mexico there, and Texas at large, really finds itself at the heart of this conversation. And examples can be drawn clearly from both sides of the table. But as we address it very specifically here to our food supply, I want to turn to my next guest to really offer a deeper historical context to this conversation of ethical food chains in this country. I turn now to Judge Laura Safer Espinosa from the Fair Food Standard Council. Judge Espinosa, let me ask you to shed a little light on the work that your organization does to, in essence, stabilize and protect the workforce so critical to our food pipeline.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you. And really a pleasure to be here this morning with all of you. I've been to the Rio Grande Valley many times. And first, not to go back into prehistoric moments, but as a law student, in the mid 70s, did an internship there, but over the years, pursuing the issues of farm labor, human rights. I have had the honor of visiting there many times with different organizations. But the way that in short, I was going to say a few words about the roots of farm labor history in the U.S. Because I think it is difficult to understand what we do without talking a little bit about that. And I think it's important to look at the history of farm labor in the US with its really all too frequent pattern of exploiting the most vulnerable workers under harsh and unsafe conditions. And all of that happens in a context of systemic exclusion from adequate legal protection. So that has been true really since the time of chattel slavery, through the post-emancipation systems of convict leasing, sharecropping, debt bondage, the abuse of migrants, whether they were farmers driven off their lands during the Dust Bowl or African Americans in the time of Jim Crow, or immigrant populations from Mexico, Asia, or Central America. And that includes participants in today's H-2A guest worker program that's been the background for so many recent cases of forced labor, also known as modern day slavery. I mean, many people, I believe, are surprised to learn that when legislation was passed in the US in the 1930s to empower workers to organize unions, bargain collectively, and be protected from retaliation for those activities, agricultural workers and domestic workers, the descendants of slaves at that time, were excluded in an effort to gain the votes of Southern congressmen. And that exclusion from federal legislation stands to this day. So the Fair Food Program does have its roots in uncovering and investigating cases of modern day slavery that the program's founders, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, uncovered and helped to investigate and prosecute, starting in the early 1990s to present day. And those operations impacted thousands of workers across multiple states, where tremendous imbalance of power allowed degraded work conditions to exist. And those cases happened at the far end of a spectrum of those degraded conditions. And the Fair Food Program really set about to reverse that imbalance of power by going to the top of the food supply chain and gaining legally binding agreements with retailers at the top of the food supply chain. I assume there'll be an opportunity to talk more in detail later, but I'll just say for now that those agreements commit those retailers to purchase preferentially from agricultural producers who are certified to be protecting workers' human rights, and to suspend purchases from growers where forced labor, child labor, and the worst systemic abuses are found. They also pay a small premium, which goes to supplement substandard wages. But the most important thing is the mechanisms that are put into place, a worker-driven code of conduct, worker education on their rights, a deep dive comprehensive audit, and a 24/7 complaint mechanism through which workers can access remedy in a way that far surpasses anything the judicial system, sad to say, as an alumni of that system, but anything, the market-based enforcement works much quicker and much more efficiently to bring access to remedy, as justice delayed is justice denied for migrants. So that is what we do in a nutshell, but I hope to have a chance to talk about it in more detail.
Thank you, Judge Espinosa. And you so beautifully articulated some of our rather dark periods of work labor force that continue to be addressed, and in some cases there is an attempt to even bury it or remove it from history. But the joy of history, of course, is that it is a living thing, and that hits you even more so when you drive down through the RGV. There's 333 miles of it. I didn't do all of it, but I went from about South Padre all the way to Roma, and probably didn't even quite do half of it. Certainly didn't get all the way down to the far western end of it, which is of course Eagle Pass, something that has been in the news quite a lot, regretfully. But when you do that, you are struck with the fact that history is this living element, and there are remnants of buildings still down there that were the former trade and commission buildings, these commerce centers along the water, and you look at the names on those buildings, and they were almost all, or at least predominantly, Latino names. And of course, that begs to look to history to understand that, well, this was all part of Mexico up until the mid 1800s, 1848 to be exact. And of course, Juneteenth, which we've just celebrated coming into this broadcast, is also very uniquely connected to Texas as well as the rest of the nation. In fact, as a segue, I want to turn to Tobias Fox, one of my panelists here, because Tobias and I were talking prior to the panel and in preparation for the panel, and I understand that you had a very unique project that you did surrounding Juneteenth specifically, and as it relates to the cotton crops. Let me introduce now Tobias Fox is Managing Director of Newark Science and Sustainability, and that's based right there in Newark, New Jersey, across the river from me. Tobias, can you tell us what that practice was and your commemoration of Juneteenth?
You can. So, yeah, Tobias Fox, I'm the founder, managing director of Newark Science and Sustainability Inc. We're a grassroots-led nonprofit in Newark, New Jersey. I'm also the founder of the Newark Community Food System, which consists of about 20 gardeners, farmers. We've learned to see each other as a resource and collaborate. So we also define the work that we do as community farming, because it's community engagement and programming is a huge part of the work that we do. And so I think it was in 2018 when I did a road trip from Dallas, Texas to Taos, New Mexico, and then to Colorado. And then I went back the way I came. And as I was driving through Texas, it was my first time ever seeing a cotton field. And so I was so moved by what I saw. Didn't even know cotton fields still existed in the United States. And so I pulled over and got out into the cotton field. Of course, this eerie feelings came over me. I started looking around, making sure nothing was going to happen to me. But then I picked some of the cotton because I wanted to be a part of that historical reference of how cotton fueled the America's economy, fueled slavery throughout the country as well. And so, and recently, more recently, about 2 summers ago, a colleague and I, a female Jewish American woman, we decided to take these cotton seeds that I collected during my road trip, and we started planting cotton in one of our gardens. And so, as a way of kind of honoring this unhidden um, history, uncovered history, I should say, Juneteenth. And so that was my way of honoring uh, our past, our legacy, and also kind of doing it in a celebratory way. And so thank you for bringing that back to my the front part of my memory. Thank you for that.
That certainly gets to what I was speaking to at the beginning of the program, of this reconnection. And that example is not only a tactile one, if you would, but certainly an emotional one, to be certain. I want to open it up to the panel in a more round robin fashion to really give us a sense of the work that you've been doing, both on a global as well as on a local level, and within the short histories of your institutions, perhaps even why they were founded, how they were founded, what problems they were addressing at that time, and what adjustments you have made over a period of time throughout the course of your organization. I'll start first with the global level and turn to John from lessons learned there. John.
Yeah, I'll give you one example because it's pretty recent with me. There was a cyclone in the East Indian Ocean on the island of Mayotte, and you're probably going to have to look that up because I did as well when I first heard about it. Mayotte is a country. It's a French government, and it's about 350,000 to 400,000 people. Their primary food supply comes from Europe, so it takes about 45 days. The ships are coming in just in time, and they're docking in Mayotte. So hurricane or cyclone Cheeto comes through, wipes the place out. Mayotte is a massive immigration area. There's about 150,000 people that are really not. They're immigrants from the Comoros, from Africa. They're living in shanty towns, and they're living day by day. They're living off the land. They're living on banana. There's small banana plantations, little things that they're harvesting, and it's wiped out by Cheeto. The food is gone. There's nowhere for these 150,000 people to go and do their small farms. The cyclone has wiped it out. The next shipment coming from France is 45 days away. Talk about a fragile environment for food. So we really scrambled to try and do whatever we could. We first looked locally, small people that could just put wood under a pot and start cooking some soups. Where can we find food as quickly as possible? And we ended up chartering a ship out of Kenya. We put about 1 million to 1.5 million meals on this ship, and it took about 5 days, a little bit longer than we like. We want to be first to the front lines, but that was one of the only options to feed people in mass. So we got pallets of rice, even water, anything that we get our hands on that we could turn on community kitchens in Mayotte. And you see this a lot, especially in immigrant populations that are affected during natural disasters, whether it be flooding, whether it be earthquakes, whether it be um, hurricanes. The most vulnerable populations are those that are suffering the most. These are people that don't have the wherewithal to last a 48 to 72 hour power outage. Everything goes bad in their fridge, or they don't have the supplies, or they live in a food desert and they can't get to where they want to go, right? They can't get fresh food. So we will generally start working in those areas as quickly as possible, whether we're sending in food trucks, whether we're working with local restaurants. In the case of, we were in Hawaii after the fires in Lahaina. We gathered as many farmers on that island as we could because they could not sell their product to the hotels that were wiped out, to the people that were suffering there. So all their product was going to go bad. So we actually set up farmers markets. We said, send us what you have. We're going to put together farmers markets, and people can just come. Here's a box, pick what you need, and go out there. And LA was the same way after the fires. We started setting up farmers markets all over the place. We started incorporating local restaurants, really trying to chip in to take care of the most vulnerable people that were there. And really, I think one of the things that sets WCK apart is working with organizations like Tobias that have local that have local resources. That's what we're looking for. That's what we want to do. We want to support the local communities. We want to support the local restaurants. We want to purchase what they have, and the more local, the better in a lot of cases. And it's certainly helpful for, again, some of those more vulnerable populations, those food deserts, where we can really make an impact.
Well, it looks like maybe even a partnership was born out of today's discussion, so that's terrific. And I have to ask you in particular, because certainly we from the outside look at all the fine work you do at World Central Kitchen, but I want to ask you, as response director, is there one particular emotionally connected story, a rosebud, as I like to call it, one rosebud for you in the work that you've done that you'd like to share, John?
In my case, I was in Madagascar, and we had set up in an orphanage, and it, again, wiped out by a cyclone. There, half of the orphanage doesn't have a roof. There's just clothes hanging all over the place, and it still hits me hard. We were working with the sisters and the nuns there to start cooking. We ordered a bunch of pots and propane, and we just started cooking, and we hired, it must have been 50 chefs, rice cookers, everything in it was a small town called Manageray. And we cooked, and we started sending food out, and it was the most heartbreaking moment. I almost embarrassed to say this, but we sent all the food out, and then the orphans showed up with their plates, and we were out of food. We had done our cooking, and I looked at these 150 to 300 kids, it must have been, all with their bowls, just smiling, trying to come in and get a meal for themselves. And we had to get everybody back cooking again, and we started playing games with the kids while we're making meals for them. And I'll tell you, we never forgot those kids again. It was a really powerful moment to see the power of food, because when these kids are showing up with their little plastic bowls and their pots and their spoons, and you forget about them, tell me that's not a dagger to the heart. And we did everything we could to make sure those kids were fed that day, and we continue to do so.
I don't think we'll now ever forget them either. Thank you, John. I want to turn from the global and go to the local. So, Dr. Everett, I want to have you bring us into this perspective, not just from the work that you're doing, of course, with the Baylor Collaborative, but also as a board member for Bread for the World, and even your humanitarian effort as a chaplain. Dr. Everett.
Well, one of the things that jumps out to me about our panelists, John, thank you for telling us that story. That is powerful. It is, since, as Dr. Rosales described before, we don't have a food system that's built for people in poverty, right? So if you don't have resources, we don't have a food system that is going to work for you. And each one of these individuals and their respective organizations are addressing that in their own way. So we don't have a market-based approach to be able to solve for this problem at this point. So it's taking all these organizations being willing to, like in John and the World Central Kitchen's stance, going into the most dangerous places on the planet to be able to identify what assets that are probably being overlooked, and utilize those assets for the benefit of people who don't have the resources they need to be able to live as God intended. So that it's a testimony to the efforts that this group is putting together, and of which I'm grateful. But also, we've got to develop a systemic response. And so our work to cultivate scalable solutions to end hunger, we combine research with public service and public policy. So we have a team of about 50 researchers that are affiliated with the collaborative and an in-house hunger data lab. And their job is to find out why we have food insecurity, what are the causes and consequences, and then what is working that has scalable potential to be able to address food insecurity in a comprehensive way. Our public service team are made up of people that live all over the state of Texas, working in real time with food insecure households and organizations that are addressing the issue, and then building like multi-sectoral collaborative infrastructure to be able to address it. And then that team also has 28,000 organizational partners in the United States and around the globe who are on the ground doing important work. And then we translate all that to policy. We know that if you're going to make crooked paths straight for people in a systemic way, policy has to be a part of it. And ideally, you need Republicans and Democrats to work together to be able to pass legislation so that it is sustainable and that one party is not trying to undo what the other party does. That could have a positive impact. So one example that we use and tell is we are typically testing out about 24 different interventions at a given time as a collaborative. One of which in 2019 was a small pilot. We had identified children in rural communities, ironically, also to Dr. Rosales' point, as well as Judge Espinosa's point, ironically, in rural communities, you are surrounded by food. Food production is everywhere. So you think about Tobias and Cotton, everybody is surrounded by food. Yet the people who live there oftentimes don't have access to it. And so in our rural communities, we are seeing higher rates of food insecurity and harsher rates of food insecurity because the charitable food infrastructure is not there. Even if you have and participate in the SNAP program, you probably don't have a grocery store. You don't have healthcare agencies. You don't have anything. You might have a church, a school, and a post office, but probably not all three. And so children specifically that are on the free and reduced lunch program, when they get out of school during the summer, the USDA summer meal program historically required kids to eat on site with other kids at what's called a congregate meal site. But in rural communities, that program didn't work. Kids live too far away from a summer meal site to be able to participate. So what we did in the summer of 2019 is we had a small demonstration project that we did with USDA, where we recruited 20 school districts in East and West Texas, who then recruited 4,000 children to participate in a 10-week demonstration project. Since we couldn't get kids to meal programs, we had to get meal programs to kids. And so we shipped, in partnership with some food distribution companies, we shipped a week's worth of food every week to each child's front porch. So they would receive 5 breakfasts, 5 lunches, and 5 snacks every week over the course of the summer. By the end of the summer, they received about 500,000 meals and snacks. And these are children that had never been able to participate in a USDA summer meal program. The research team led by Urban Institute found that the program had equal to or greater impact than the National School Lunch Program, which historically has been the gold standard for addressing child hunger. So during the pandemic, before the pandemic, we were planning to scale the program to New Mexico and Alaska when USDA called and asked us to scale the program nationwide during the shutdown. So we ended up serving 270,000 children in 43 states, plus Puerto Rico. Kids were so remote in places like Alaska, it literally took boats, barges, seaplanes. We even got reports of dog sled teams taking boxes of food to kids. The Havasu tribal community received boxes of food via mule teams, and then UPS drivers and USPS drivers dropped food boxes off everywhere else. So the second summer, we served about 40 million meals to kids as a collective effort. It took USDA and state agencies, school districts, took Congress passing legislation in a bipartisan capacity to make the resources available. But it ended up having 3 times the positive impact on childhood food insecurity than the National School Lunch Program. But we were able to continue to test the pilot and then ultimately work with Congress to pass permanent legislation to make a non-congregate option or a home delivered option a permanent option for kids in rural America. And so we're excited to see that infrastructure be built. We'll participate with states to build that, but ultimately it'll be run by communities themselves. So for us, what we're looking at are who are these disproportionately experienced, high poverty populations that don't have targeted interventions for them, and then developing a solution that we think could be scaled so that it can become infrastructure. It's like we never think about the school lunch program. It exists, right? Every school provides the school lunch program. We don't have to think about it. And that is how we directly impact food security. And the same was true for summer. And so we were trying to figure out for kids in these rural communities how we could help build infrastructure so that they have consistent access to food. So those are the kinds of things that we're looking for. There are dozens of different disproportionately affected populations that need interventions developed for them. But that's the kind of stuff that we're looking for. And Bread for the World's job is to take that and make that permanent legislation.
Well, let me unpack that a little bit, because there's three pillars there that I think we should really drill down on. One is the immediate availability and resource to food. You talked about food being around us. And then there is, of course, communities where there's less food around us for various reasons. At least the supply is coming from the outside and pushing in. And of course, we know there's extra vulnerability there. And then the last one that I heard within that is the aspect of course, policy, setting policy, protecting policy, policy reform. So to go first to the aspect of available food near us and then the implications on supply chain, I'm going to turn to my other urban city dweller, and that's Tobias, across the river there in Newark, New Jersey. Tobias, if you could speak to that within an urban sprawl sensibility, and where we have less food native to our immediate area, it is all being brought in, and much of it commercially at that. And can you speak to that? And of course, we were talking offline a little bit about the pandemic and lessons learned on the supply chain, the imposition that was on the supply chain. Could you share a little bit of what you experienced there in Newark, and again, how your organization worked within those ramifications? Tobias?
And New Jersey is called the Garden State.
Ironically, yes.
And it's over a million families in New Jersey that are food insecure, unfortunately, which is bizarre. But the pandemic really uncovered, showed in our faces the vulnerabilities in our how vulnerable our food system really is, and then also it showed who gets access to food and who doesn't. But we have to also make the distinction between food access and healthy food access. And
Yeah.
so food access is, you're hungry, here's a ham sandwich, but healthy food access is very nutritional based food, and we try to promote it from a local perspective by making more food locally accessible, using sustainable farming practices. And the pandemic really pushed a lot of farmers to kind of think out of the box as well, in terms of how do we deliver the food that we're growing. Um, because now then people started creating these kind of online subscription programs. I took a model that was more so predominantly in a more rural and suburban community, which is the community supported agriculture program, or CSA model. I brought that into Newark, whereas hey, here's a, um, a food system program that you can subscribe to in advance, and it guarantees you up to 20 weeks weekly produce packages. But the difference with us is that our program is subsidized. And so through grants and donations, we're able to waive the cost of the membership fee. And that allows us to focus more on identifying families in need, but also pumping up the awareness component, the education component to it, and so providing food cooking demonstrations, providing more content on the nutritional value of the food that people are receiving, and then also kind of understanding people's social behaviors around food and around land, and how land kind of helps us provide the food that we need. And so we really take a really community engaged, that's why we call it community farming, because we can't do it without engaging the community. And because our social systems are so locked into our economic system, it really causes and creates so many social ills and problems that we're having, and trying to understand the disconnect we have. And so with food. And so if and I get into so many debates with our vegan restaurant owners, because they make it so unaccessible for a lot of people because of the price point. And so the pandemic was a huge learning experience, but it also shifted the mindsets of a lot of farmers of how do we kind of think out of the box to make it more accessible for people in our communities.
Tobias, you are really addressing a key point here, I think, in food education and the importance and the relevance of that. And I know, Dr. Rosales, also you work very much in this area, not just from the default sense of being an academic with the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. But one of the things you reference in the body of work you do is something you call justice-centered approach. And I would love to have you just explain that and its relevance to the work and the importance, the critical importance of education within this, not just of us folks, but even experts who you are re-educating in essence to help them find better ways of going at business. Dr. Rosales.
Right. Well, yeah, that's a great question. The justice-centered approach that we use in our program is really an outcomes-oriented approach, and it's doing research, teaching, and outreach as if people mattered. This is the entire conversation we've been having today, this morning, and ultimately, it's trying to find communities with a certain assets or needs, and trying to create and co-create new knowledge to be able to address those needs. So for example, we host a monthly meeting. We call it the Food Advisory Council. These are folks who are from all sectors of the food system, educators, food procurement folks. We have lawyers, we have municipal governments, and we get together and we learn together about some of the issues and ways that we can address those issues internally here in the Rio Grande Valley. We have students on the panels. We have folks who are just there to learn and to share with each other. And some of the things that we discuss is how do we address some of the challenges that we've mentioned here ourselves without much dependence on maybe external forces. I think this is something that is that we've come to acknowledge over the last 3 years. We've been having these monthly meetings, is that really that we're trying to do is try to address these slow disasters that have happened in our region for a number of decades, right? I mean, John is done so well of addressing what we call kind of very obvious disasters. There's an immediate need after a hurricane or a storm. But these slow disasters that are developing over time is where, communities are trying to both identify and address these issues, which could be informed with new knowledge. So this is part of that justice-centered research approach, which is like, how do we get that knowledge and where do we get that information from? And so I do this in a lot of my work. I work a lot with farmers, participatory action work, where we look at different agronomic techniques on farm with farmers in real life farming conditions to see how some of these theoretical framed approaches may work in an applied way, right? And answering the questions that farmers are asking, not necessarily questions that are interesting academically. One thing that I found is the best way to learn. I mean, I don't pretend that this is the answer, but I do know that sitting around and having honest discussions, sitting around a table, sharing food sometimes is one of the best ways to learn. And so what we've done is we've hosted different meetings throughout the year, which culminates in an annual food summit, where we try and condense some of our discussions over the course of a year, and we share that with the general public and see how they respond. So some of our meetings may center around local solutions. One meeting in particular that I'd like to point out is one that we brokered between the city of Mission, Texas, the superintendent of Mission ISD, the independent school district, a food distributor, and a citrus farmer. And the question that we just had them discuss is why is all the citrus that you're serving in Mission ISD from California? And why not? Why not Mission, Texas? We had a farmer who was 4 miles away from the school headquarters, and who's struggling as a family farmer of citrus to try and have a stable economy. So how do we solve those issues um, together? And I can tell you as a spoiler alert that after a couple of really deep conversations, one of which included bringing the food purchasing specialists out to the farm and having them taste a citrus from the tree. I mean, then in a few weeks later, having the school district actually purchase citrus from that farmer for the first time in history was a huge was something to celebrate for us, because at the very least it set a precedent that it can be done. And you know, and what I'd like to add to that, it happens because we start to identify some shared values and shared outcomes, right? The school district wants kids to eat healthy foods, but they also have a responsibility to the communities and the students and their families, where, you know, to support a local citrus economy. And the farmers don't want to necessarily export all their food, and they want to be able to find a stable a purchaser that can help supply and support, I mean, that can help support them. And so these are the kinds of strategies that we use, that are in that way just justice centered, because what we're trying to do is address issues that help farmers, food, food specialists, and consumers alike.
Dr. Salas, I also want to go back to one of the other pillars that we flagged there, which is, of course, policy analysis, policy reform. And certainly, as I was reading up on this area, one of the federal agencies that continue to pop up is USDA, of course. I'm wondering, do you work with them? Are there other federal agencies, or what are the other sources that you go to that we should know about?
Local school districts and local governments are probably some of the easiest screws to turn, because action can be initiated immediately, right? I mean, sometimes it's a big, large boat, the federal government, and trying to have it turn around to address a small rural region like the Rio Grande Valley. Sometimes it's hard. But you know, even school governments, for example, ISDs, can change the way that they send out a bid for produce, right? So that local farmers can respond to that. You know, like local ISDs can decide, hey, why don't we change and have a mileage, a locality requirement where our food has to come. We'll give preference to vendors that come from within 250 miles. And that's small policy change that's very local, but it can have an immediate effect, as it has had in some of our regions here in the Rio Grande Valley.
And Dr. Everett, same question for you, of course. Are there agencies and entities, both on the federal level and also, to follow up on Dr. Salas, what he said, turning the screws locally? I love that. Are there local agencies or entities that you find you are working with?
Dr. Salas, that's a great, I appreciated that example and the fact that you have the relational rapport with your farmers in the RGV area. It can connect your farmers directly to the school district. That represents an enormous amount of trust that you have built and cultivated in your community. And I know the work that you and Dr. Torres do is incredible. They are bending crooked paths straight on a regular basis on a policy level, both locally as well as on the state level. But state agencies are another great way to be able to work with them. You know, so it's an imperative, for example, for the Texas Agriculture Commissioner to try to produce as much food as he possibly, you know, help the system produce as much food as it possibly can in Texas, but also to stay in Texas. And so and they oversee all of our federal nutrition programs for children. And so those state agencies can really prioritize how food is purchased on the local level. And because they also oversee the part, the school district implementation of child nutrition programs. So there's a lot of opportunity there. One of the inspiring things that we've seen on a global level is in Guatemala, after they built their national school lunch program just about a decade ago. They passed legislation to require that all schools buy 50% of their food from smallholder farmers. And so that not only created opportunities for kids to go to school, it doubled participation in elementary school, but it also created market-based opportunities for smallholder farmers to be able to sell their food. So the kids are not only getting a lunch, they're also getting the highest quality food available to them and strengthening farmers that they probably knew, may have even been related to. The other agency is USAID. You know, of course, USAID doesn't exist anymore, but in whatever form or fashion, the programs that it managed, like the McGovern-Dole program that created school lunch programs around the world, that's going to be something that we need to be attentive to, because we know right now that food insecurity is the primary driver of forced migration, and certainly there in the Rio Grande Valley, we have seen periods of high rates of forced migration because people simply couldn't put food on the table. Now is not necessarily one of those times, but we've certainly seen that in the past. So you're thinking about local agencies, state agencies, and federal agencies all really working together simultaneously.
Well, before we leave this aspect of policy, I want to come back to our judge on this because, of course, policy analysis, policy reform is very much her lane. And I want to ask you very specifically, Judge Espinosa, how do we take the data that's being gathered in the field by, let's say, Dr. Rosales and his team and Dr. Everett and his team, how do we take that then to inform policy analysis and thereby hopefully generate sound policy that works for all and works in partnership, much the way Dr. Everett just said? Your Honor.
I mean, there's a couple of things, if you'll allow me, to circle back to a couple of points that the previous panelists were making before I launch into that question. First of all, I think on the theme of food insecurity itself, one of the ultimate ironies in not just in the US, but across the world, is that the people who grow and harvest the food we eat are so often surrounded by food all day long, and yet are food insecure themselves. And one thing that I think hasn't been mentioned yet today is that the analysis that the Fair Food Program finally uh, relied on to build its model was to really look to the top of the food supply chain, because in the past 40-ish, 30 to 40-ish years, there's been tremendous consolidation at the top of the food supply chain in the form of large food retailers, and they really are able to drive price points in a way that's unprecedented in our history. And unlike, past organizing attempts from the field, workers who founded the Fair Food Program realized that they were actually on the same side as the farmers in that equation of facing that downward pressure from the top of the food supply chain, and that there wasn't likely to be some policy change or legal reform that was going to change that. So they did what has been done successfully, I would say, a couple of times in US history, and to great effect when it has been done well, which is to reach out to consumers of conscience across the country and to make common cause with them, and to have people recognize that it is in everyone's best interest that the people who harvest the food we eat should also be able to feed their families. So I just did want to say that, and that partnership is what's enabled an area that federal prosecutors called ground zero for modern day slavery, when the Fair Food Program started, into what's become known as the best work environment in U.S. history. And fortunately, the history of agriculture. I mean, fortunately, now we're in 23 states and multiple crops, but it still requires, since this is not a top-down effort, it still requires that consumer worker uh, uh, concerted action to make it happen and to achieve the legally binding agreements with retailers at the top of the food supply chain that give organizations like the one I direct the power to enforce through their power of the purchasing order, if you will, the market-based enforcement, which is extremely powerful. And if anybody's wondering about the standards that I'm talking about here, I'd say as a judge that what we are talking about is 95% follow the law, which is too often honored in the breach. But now to your question about policy, I would say that there are moments in history when it's really important to reflect on the efficacy of leading by doing as opposed to traditional lobbying. Um, in many more instances than people realize, action on the ground, like some of the ones that my co-panelists are describing, have really preceded legislative and systemic policy change. And we have a few examples of that from the Fair Food Program, which is the worker organization that founded the program. They really pioneered the victim-centered, multi-sectoral approach to forced labor investigations. And they didn't set out to lobby, but in doing so, they helped to shape the Historic Victims of Trafficking and Violence Act that was passed in 2000. And then just through sharing best practices for those forced labor investigations, the DOJ was ultimately influenced to create the anti-trafficking unit, which when they started fit in the backseat of a Border Patrol agent's car, and is now institutionalized within the government. But it uses a victim-centered human rights approach to those investigations as opposed to the traditional organized crime approach. And that was a dramatic shift and definitely signified a profound policy change. And we've trained numerous law enforcement agencies to good effect in that way. But similarly, the practice of identifying and publicly naming suppliers and buyers that are connected to labor abuse eventually became Department of Labor standard practice. And you all have mentioned the USDA numerous times with good reason. The USDA's, I don't know if you're familiar with the Farm Labor Stabilization and Protection pilot program, but they did implement a program that provided the highest economic incentives to agricultural employers that implemented protections for the most vulnerable guest workers by either joining the Fair Food Program or signing a collective bargaining agreement. And that resulted in a dramatic expansion of the program's protections across almost half of the continental US. So again, a big policy change, not necessarily legislative change. And the last example I'll mention is that in 2021, and I think no matter what people's political stripe, there is a growing recognition that temperatures and heat indexes are rising and that something must be done, on numerous levels to secure our food supply chain. And one of the things that the Fair Food Program did was to implement heat stress protocols that were really innovative and do not, and only maybe 3 or 4 now states have anything similar, but there is still nothing on the federal level, but we have been called to testify before federal agencies that are seeking to implement heat stress protocols for workforces to ensure that the people who work all day under the sun to produce our food are able to be relatively healthy, at least healthy enough to continue their efforts on behalf of our families and their own families. So we are hopeful that eventually that will become a more widespread policy implemented as well.
Well, certainly those frontline workers know firsthand the severity of the weather conditions and how much that heat has increased over the years, despite how much it may be disputed by others. I want to very specifically, though, harken back to a conversation you and I had offline in preparation for today, and I'll admit it, I'll call it a good New York skepticism that I expressed when you told me how many top-end industry, big corporations were actually coming to the table and working with the Fair Foods Standards Council. Can you talk to that a little bit?
By the consumer, I mean, they were consumer-based, consumer worker-based campaigns in almost all instances, although I will say that some of the largest, there are now 14 major food retailers, food services, fast food chains that are participate in the program. And one of the largest actually came on their own, seeking to, I believe, no longer have their names attached with headlines about things that were happening at the bottom of their food supply chain. So it is a really incredible risk prevention mechanism to make workers the frontline monitors of their own rights. They're out there when, you know, a once a year audit can never be. So if you empower them and protect them from retaliation, they will do better jobs for agricultural employers than the most highly paid risk prevention consultants could ever do.
Well, Judge Espinosa, I love consciousness of consumers because that is certainly something. I'm of a generation who know the power of the boycott, and I was raised by a generation that certainly knew that and had participated in many. And I think we're getting back to that a little bit in more recent activities where we have seen boycotts already coming back in and actually making a statement, making a very clear statement with where we will spend our money and won't spend our money. And in fact, let me follow up on that with all the other panelists. I've put you in the hot seat now. It's your turn to return the favor. What can we do? Put us in the hot seat. What can we do as consumers, as individuals, ones that are not working alongside and with agencies such as your own? Are there small adjustments to our behavior, be it in consumerism or other, that we can in turn assist you in what you do in making a change? Panel.
Snap cuts. The thing that we need you to be mindful of as it's related to legislation specifically. You know, in the House budget, $290 billion were proposed in cuts to SNAP, the largest amount of cuts ever proposed. And so that would be detrimental to low-income households who depend upon that program. As you can imagine, most people who utilize that program that are not children or not elderly living on fixed incomes are working and employed. And so that program is really a work support program. In Texas alone, we reclaim about $7 billion worth of benefits. And for every dollar that comes into the community, it has $1.80 worth of economic stimulative effect. So not only are you addressing hunger in a comprehensive way, but you're also strengthening the local economy. And the National Grocers Association has told me that that program accounts for 1 out of about every 10 jobs you see in a local grocery store. So we certainly don't want to see that program get cut. You know, you don't want to balance a budget on the backs of the poorest people in our country, and so that's something that we would certainly encourage the listeners to communicate to their members, so that we don't go the wrong direction.
SNAP, very much, and communicating our disapproval of any of the policies that would take that away. Thank you, Dr. Everett. Dr. Rosales, I also turn to you and ask you the same question.
Well, one recommendation I can give to folks is to just buy local as best they can. This goes back to what Judge was mentioning about how we can be more conscious as a consumer. Sometimes it feels like you're not making much of a difference, but it makes a lot of difference to the people that you're purchasing from. And so I think that real personalized connection, you know, and not when I say shop local, don't just go there and buy, but, you know, go there and ask and talk and be willing to learn. I encourage people to always be curious about their food, where it's from, and how it's grown, and who's behind it. And that's a very simple message I can give to folks listening in.
I love it. Clear and simple. Shop local, and of course, ask questions, educate, learn. Judge Espinosa.
Thank you. Well, we all eat, and as my fellow panelists have pointed out, maybe not certainly not everyone eating well enough or adequately enough, but we all eat, and we do too often not think about how that food got there, who grew it, whose hands harvested those crops. So I would just ask that people do one very simple thing is be aware of that, be aware that the food does not miraculously appear there, but that it is the result of lots of hard labor, both on behalf of farmers and the farm workers who are in those fields every day. And we would ask that you look to ask yourselves, why is not all our food fair food? Why are all workers not protected by basic human rights protections? And check out the Fair Food Program, see what you can do to help support bringing it locally to your area.
Thank you, Judge Espinosa, for that. Absolutely a small adjustment we could make, and just a level of curiosity we should innately have, but certainly out of a greater humanitarian good. So I thank you for that. Tobias, let me ask you the same.
I'm just going to echo supporting the local food systems movement, if you will, and supporting your local growers, your local farmers, encouraging your local gardeners to kind of continue uh, digging into the soil and trying their best to keep our communities healthy, and also please connect and share through social media as much as possible.
Tobias, I love the little extra nod there to social media, because certainly we knock it all the time, and probably well deserved, but it can occasionally, if used right, serve really to inform and serve for a community of good. So I know, since preparing for this program, just in my feed alone, all sorts of great things are now coming up in it about regenerative farming, sustainability. I even have gotten some really great ones on alternative chicken coops. So now I'm not going to go build one in the middle of New York City, but nonetheless, it's not only entertaining and uplifting, but it is informative in its own right to know that this work is going on out there, and that there is a new movement in this direction. So thank you for being part of it. Now, John, I'm coming to you next and last to bring us out for a close on this question, and not just, of course, from the local level, but from, once again, the global level, and in addition, from just the simplicity of being a chef and actually being in charge of getting that food out from the kitchen, realizing it on the plate, as beautiful presentation as it is, and bringing it to us, ready to eat it and receive it. What do you have to add?
I think I love what everybody said about buying locally. I think it's so important. Searching out, making sure that you're helping the community, and that really leads to kind of, I think, what our end game should be is get involved. Figure out where to go to get the best food, figure out where it's coming from. In disaster relief, how can you help? How can you connect resources to be able to help people? How can you deliver a hot meal? How can you deliver a warm blanket? How can you provide power generation to somebody whose refrigerator and home's down, AC, whatever it takes, especially as the world does get a little bit hotter. Like I said, I think getting involved is one of the most important things that people can do. Keep your eyes open, buying locally, and just really be a caring person.
Well, there you have it. Some wonderful small adjustments we can all do in our daily lives to not only appreciate our food a lot better and those that work to get it to us, but also in ways that maybe we can support each of these wonderful panelists in all the work they're doing through their organizations. I encourage you to check out the organizations online. If you are able to donate, make a donation. Certainly, I know it will be appreciated. Also, be sure to link in You have the names of each of the panelists. You see that they wear both their heart and their humanity on the sleeve, so make sure you link in. That is what that platform is from. I can make you this promise too, that as a documentary filmmaker, as a digital journalist, as someone who lifts his voice in issue and question and concern, I'll continue to do that to amplify good cause such as these and the fine work that these folks are doing through their organizations. And I encourage you to join me, not only by tuning in, but certainly like, comment, subscribe to the channel for Cause. And you can watch some of the other content there as well to see what our Harmony and Chaos series is all about and how it's bringing discussion on both sides of the aisle to the table. And I think certainly this program shows that, you know, we can address these issues best when we sit down and break bread together at the table. So it's a perfect example today with the future of food conversation that we've been having. I want to thank once again my co-partners and co-producers on this, the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, Dr. Torres and Dr. Ortiz, certainly my co-producer, Libe Hammaker, thank you so much. And I thank all of you for tuning in, taking the time to listen, and taking the time to respond. Once again, until the next time, stay safe, stay well. See you soon.